The salt-crusted shores of the fishing hamlet stretch before us, eternal and damned, where the remnants of Byrgenwerth's greatest atrocity echo through the hunter's nightmare. Here, where the boundary between waking horror and cursed dream grows thin, the screams of the innocent still reverberate across decades of guilt and madness. The weathered wood of ancient docks creaks under phantom weight, and the stench of rotting fish mingles with something far worse, the lingering miasma of systematic slaughter, of heads split open in pursuit of forbidden knowledge, of a great one's corpse desecrated in the name of human ascension. Welcome, lore seekers, to another deep dive with Keen 7 Lore, where today we're reconstructing one of the most horrific events in all of Bloodborne's twisted history. The Fishing Hamlet Massacre stands as more than just another atrocity in a world already drowning in blood. It represents the original sin that would curse every hunter who followed, the moment when scholarly ambition transformed into unforgivable brutality. What happened on those fog-shrouded shores wasn't merely murder. It was the systematic destruction of an entire community, the violation of beings touched by the cosmos, and the defilement of a dead god's corpse that would birth a curse so powerful it transcended death itself. The story we're about to unravel isn't found in any single tome or whispered confession. Instead, it's scattered across the hunter's nightmare like fragments of a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a different angle of the horror. Through the fishing hamlet. Priests' dying prayers for vengeance, through Lady Maria's eternal vigil over secrets she died trying to protect, through the endless crying of an orphan that should never have been torn from its mother's corpse. These are the testimonies that allow us to piece together what truly transpired when Byrgenwerth's hunters descended upon that isolated village. As we journey through this reconstruction, minute by agonizing minute, we'll witness how Master Willem's obsession with evolution drove his followers to commit acts that would make even the blood-drunk hunters of later generations recoil in horror. We'll stand beside Lady Maria as she watches her mentor and companions transform from scholars into butchers, feel the weight of the rakuyo in her hands as she realizes what she's become, and understand why she would ultimately cast her beloved weapon into the depths rather than carry the stain of its deeds. The Fishing Hamlet Massacre wasn't a battle, or even a hunt in any traditional sense. The villagers, already transformed by their proximity to the Great One Kos, possessed no meaningful way to resist the trained killers who came for them. What unfolded was methodical, calculated, and utterly without mercy. A harvesting of eyes and secrets that treated conscious beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited. And when the killing was done, when the scholars had taken their fill of cosmic knowledge, they committed their final and most blasphemous act, the desecration of Kos herself and the theft of her unborn child. Before the hunters arrived, before the first drop of blood stained those ancient stones, the fishing hamlet existed in a state of bizarre tranquility. The massive corpse of Kos had washed ashore during a storm that the eldest villagers still remembered in fragmented whispers, a night when the very stars seemed to scream and the ocean itself recoiled from what it had surrendered to the land. She was already dead when the waves delivered her to the hamlet's shore, though what force could kill a great one remains one of the deeper mysteries surrounding these events. Some among the Byrgenwerth scholars would later theorize that great ones exist in states beyond our simple binary of life and death, that Kos's death was merely a transition to a different form of existence. But for the villagers who discovered her mountainous form sprawled across their beach, theological debates meant nothing compared to the immediate, visceral reality of change that her presence brought. The transformation began almost immediately, though whether this was Kos's final gift, her corpse's natural influence, or the work of the countless parasites that inhabited her decaying flesh remains uncertain. The villagers found themselves changing day by day, their skin taking on a greyish pallor that glistened with perpetual moisture, their eyes growing large and bulbous, better suited to pierce the depths of the dark ocean than to endure the harsh light of day. Their bodies elongated, fingers stretching into webbed appendages, spines curving in ways that made standing fully upright increasingly uncomfortable. But rather than fleeing in horror from these mutations, the villagers embraced them as blessings, signs that they had been chosen by the cosmos itself for transformation into something greater than mere humanity. They began to worship Kos with a devotion that transcended simple reverence. Every morning, the entire village would gather on the beach to sing hymns that sounded more like whale songs than human prayers, their transformed vocal cords producing harmonies that no unchanged throat could replicate. They built shrines from driftwood and shells, decorated with the strange barnacles that grew in abundance on their own skulls, the very same growths that Byrgenwerth would later identify as physical manifestations of insight, literal eyes on the inside that granted the villagers their uncanny wisdom and cosmic awareness. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of Bloodborne's darkest chapters so far, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It makes a real difference in helping this video reach fellow hunters and lore enthusiasts through YouTube's algorithm. Your support means everything and helps keep these in-depth explorations of the cosmos coming. The discovery of the fishing Hamlet by Byrgenwerth scholars wasn't accidental. Master Willem had long theorized about the existence of communities that had been touched by the Great Ones, places where the barrier between human and cosmic had grown thin enough for true transformation to occur. His research into the ancient Pthumerian civilization had revealed tantalizing hints about the patterns of Great One appearances throughout history, and his calculations suggested that, somewhere along the coast, evidence of recent contact might be found. When reports reached Byrgenwerth of a fishing village whose inhabitants had stopped trading with nearby settlements, whose boats no longer ventured beyond the harbour, Willem knew he had found what he sought. The initial scouting expedition returned to Byrgenwerth with reports that exceeded even Willem's most ambitious expectations. Not only had the villagers been transformed by proximity to a Great One, but the corpse of the Great One itself remained on the shore, a mountain of decaying divine flesh that promised secrets beyond imagination. The scouts described the barnacle-like growths on the villagers' skulls, the way their eyes seemed to perceive dimensions beyond the merely physical, the inhuman wisdom that pervaded even their simplest utterances. Here was living proof that evolution beyond humanity was possible, that the barriers between human and Great One could be overcome. Master Willem's response was immediate and decisive. This opportunity could not be allowed to slip away, could not be left to the slow tools of observation and negotiation. The villagers, in their transformed state, would never willingly submit to the examinations and experiments necessary to unlock their secrets. Their devotion to Kos was absolute, their protection of her corpse unwavering. If Byrgenwerth was to seize this unprecedented chance to understand the mechanics of human ascension, more direct methods would be required. The scholars would need hunters. The selection of the expedition team reveals much about Byrgenwerth's state at this crucial moment in its history. Gehrman, the first hunter, was an obvious choice. His skill with blades was already legendary, his loyalty to Willem's vision unquestioned. But Gehrman didn't come alone. He brought his greatest student, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, a woman whose Canehurst lineage granted her abilities beyond those of ordinary hunters. Her presence would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the expedition, as her noble sensibilities would clash violently with the brutal reality of what Willem demanded. Whether Lawrence participated directly in the massacre remains a matter of scholarly debate, with evidence pointing in multiple directions. His later actions as founder of the Healing Church certainly demonstrate a willingness to sacrifice innocence for perceived greater goods, but some testimonies suggest he was already beginning his split from Willem during this period. The potential involvement of Micolash adds another layer of uncertainty. The man who would later found the School of Mensis certainly possessed both the ambition and the lack of moral restraint necessary for such an undertaking, but confirmed records of his presence remain elusive. If you're finding value in this exploration of Byrgenwerth's dark history, consider subscribing to support the channel and join our growing community of lore enthusiasts. Your support truly makes these deep investigations into gaming's most complex narratives possible. The expedition departed Byrgenwerth on a morning shrouded in mist, a detail that survivors would later interpret as an omen of the horror to come. The hunters travelled light, carrying specialized equipment that revealed the true nature of their mission, not the tools of war, but the implements of harvest. Bone saws designed to cut through skulls with minimal damage to the tissues within. Collection vials specially treated to preserve organic matter touched by cosmic influence. And most telling of all, the Trepanning equipment, hand drills and skull keys that would allow them to access the interior of living skulls while keeping the subjects conscious, based on Willem's theory that the cosmic awareness granted by the barnacles required an active mind to maintain its connection. The journey to the Hamlet took 3 days through increasingly desolate territory. The closer they drew to their destination, the more the natural world seemed to recoil from what awaited. Birds fell silent, animals fled, and even the vegetation grew twisted and wrong, as if the very presence of Koss's corpse warped reality in expanding ripples. On the second night of their journey, Maria reportedly questioned Gehrman about the true nature of their mission, expressing concerns about the equipment they carried and the secrecy surrounding their objectives. Gehrman's response, according to fragmentary records, was simply that they would do what was necessary for humanity's evolution. That sentiment had no place in the pursuit of transcendence. The morning of the massacre dawned grey and cold, with a thick fog rolling in from the sea that seemed to muffle sound itself. The hunters approached the hamlet from the landward side, moving through the twisted trees with practiced stealth. Their first view of the transformed villagers confirmed everything the scouts had reported, and more. The beings that had once been simple fishermen now moved with an alien grace, their elongated limbs and bulbous eyes giving them an appearance that straddled the line between pitiful and transcendent. They went about their morning routines with no awareness of the doom approaching, some tending to strange gardens of sea plants that grew in unnatural patterns, others maintaining the shrines to Koss with a devotion that bordered on the automatic. The first death came swift and silent. A villager gathering kelp at the edge of the settlement simply crumpled as Maria's. Blade found the precise point where spine met skull, severing consciousness in an instant. She had argued for quick deaths, if deaths there must be, and initially, Gehrman had agreed. But as the hunters moved deeper into the hamlet, and the villagers began to realize what was happening, the clinical precision of assassination gave way to something far uglier. The screaming began when a child, or what had once been a child, witnessed its parent's head being opened with a bone saw while they still lived, the hunter carefully extracting the barnacle-like growths while ignoring the victim's inhuman shrieks. The child's cry alerted the entire hamlet, and suddenly the hunters found themselves facing not resistance, but something far more disturbing: mass panic among beings who possessed no real ability to fight back. The villagers tried to flee, their transformed bodies ill-suited for rapid movement on land, their webbed appendages slipping on their own blood as the hunters methodically cut them down. What followed can only be described as systematic butchery wearing the mask of scientific inquiry. The hunters divided into teams. Some focused on preventing escapes, while others began the grim work of extraction. The trepanning procedures that Willem had insisted upon proved even more horrible in practice than in theory. The villagers were pinned down, their skulls carefully opened, while they remained conscious, the barnacle growths pried from the interior of their craniums with implements that resembled nothing so much as oyster knives. The screams that emerged from these procedures transcended normal human vocalization, taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate with reality itself, causing the fog to swirl in unnatural patterns and the ground to vibrate with frequencies beyond hearing. Lady Maria's participation in these acts would haunt her beyond death itself. Witnesses to the hunter's nightmare report that her phantom still whispers apologies to victims whose names she never knew, still sees their transformed faces in every shadow. During the massacre itself, she initially tried to maintain some semblance of honor, ensuring quick deaths where possible. But the sheer scope of what Willem demanded made mercy impossible. When she found herself holding down a villager child, while another hunter extracted the growths from its skull, something inside her broke. The rakuyo, her beloved weapon that had been a symbol of her noble Cainhurst heritage, became irreversibly stained not just with blood, but with the weight of unforgivable acts. The villagers who survived the initial assault attempted to mount something resembling a defense, gathering in the square before Koss's corpse. Their prayers took on a desperate quality, no longer worship, but pleas for intervention, for justice, for vengeance. The fishing Hamlet priest, an elderly villager whose transformation had progressed further than most, stood before the assembled hunters and spoke words that would echo through eternity. His curse wasn't mere words, but a prayer that resonated with whatever spark of consciousness remained in Koss's dead form. "Lay the curse of blood upon them, and their children's children forevermore," he intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that made several of the hunters stagger. "Each wretched birth will plunge each child into a lifetime of misery. Grant us eyes, to cleanse our beastly idiocy." The hunters cut him down mid-prayer, but the damage was already done. Something in the fabric of reality shifted, though the full implications wouldn't become clear until much later. At the time, the expedition members felt only a vague unease, a sense that invisible eyes had turned their attention to this beach, this moment, these acts. They pushed forward with their mission, driven by Willem's insistence that the knowledge they sought justified any cost. The systematic execution of the remaining villagers proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Bodies were stacked like cordwood, heads removed and split open in search of more barnacle growths, more physical evidence of insight made manifest. The hunters filled vial after vial with organic matter that pulsed with cosmic energy, each sample representing not just scientific data, but the final remains of a being that had transcended baseline humanity, only to be reduced to components in Byrgenwerth's great experiment. It was Gehrman who first suggested they investigate Koss herself. The Great One's corpse dominated the beach, a mountain of pale flesh that seemed to breathe despite its obvious state of decay. As they approached, several hunters reported hearing something that shouldn't have been possible. The sound of a heartbeat emanating from within the massive corpse. Not the heartbeat of Koss herself, but something else. Something that had been growing within her when she died, sustained by processes that defied biological understanding. The decision to cut into Koss's body represented the final transgression, the act that transformed Massacre into sacrilege. Using the same bone saws that had opened villager skulls, the hunters carved through divine flesh that parted like water beneath their blades. The stench that emerged was indescribable, not merely the rot of death, but the smell of dimensions folding in on themselves, of reality struggling to contain something that shouldn't exist in this plane. And there, in what would have been a womb, if great ones reproduced in ways comprehensible to human understanding, they found the orphan. The thing that would later manifest in the hunter's nightmare as a screaming, violent spectre was, at this moment, something far more pitiful, an unborn great one, not quite dead, but certainly not alive in any conventional sense, suspended in fluids that glowed with bioluminescence. Its features were partially formed, caught between human and cosmic, in ways that hurt to perceive directly. Most disturbing, of all, it seemed aware of their presence, its unopened eyes tracking their movements, its malformed mouth opening and closing in silent screams that nevertheless resonated in the hunters' minds. The extraction of the orphan, and what Byrgenwerth scholars would later term the umbilical cord, required tools specifically designed for the task, implements that Willem had prepared based on his studies of Pthumerian techniques for interfacing with Great One physiology. As they cut the orphan free from its mother's corpse, several hunters reported experiencing visions, fragmentary glimpses of cosmic vistas, of dimensions where physics followed different rules, of the vast loneliness that great ones endured in their supremely isolated existence. Maria would later describe feeling the orphan's consciousness brush against her own, leaving behind an impression of confusion, fear, and a rage so pure it transcended emotion and became a force of nature. The umbilical cord itself defied easy categorization. It wasn't truly a cord in any biological sense, but rather a crystallized conduit of connection between the orphan and its mother, a physical manifestation of the metaphysical bond between Great One and offspring. When they severed it, the sound that emerged from both the orphan and Kos's corpse was like reality itself screaming in protest. Several hunters collapsed, blood streaming from their eyes and ears, their minds unable to process what they had witnessed. Those who remained standing would later report that in that moment, they felt something fundamental break in the world, as if a law of nature had been violated in a way that could never be fully repaired. With their grim harvest complete, the expedition began preparing for withdrawal. The beach was littered with bodies, the sand stained red and black with fluids that shouldn't exist. The few villagers who had escaped the initial massacre had fled to the sea, their transformed bodies allowing them to survive in the depths where the hunters couldn't follow. These survivors would become the seeds of the curse's manifestation, their prayers and anguish feeding the growing nightmare that Kos's violated spirit was weaving from their suffering. Lady Maria's breakdown began during the return journey to Byrgenwerth. The weight of what they had done, the systematic nature of the slaughter, the violation of beings that had harmed no one, it all crashed down upon her with the force of revelation. She had been raised with notions of honor, of the warrior's code, of the nobility inherent in her Cainhurst blood. But there had been no honor in the fishing hamlet, no glory in the extraction of eyes from screaming victims, no nobility in the desecration of Kos and the theft of her orphan. By the time they reached Byrgenwerth, she had made her decision. The scene at the Byrgenwerth well has been reconstructed from multiple sources, each adding details to the moment when Lady Maria cast away the Rakuyo. She arrived alone, in the dead of night, carrying the weapon that had been her companion through countless battles. Witnesses describe her standing at the well's edge for hours, speaking to the blade as if it could hear her, apologizing for the shame she had brought upon it. When she finally released her grip and let the Rakuyo fall into the darkness, the splash that echoed from below seemed to carry with it the weight of her abandoned honor. Her resignation from Willem's service followed immediately. The master tried to convince her that their actions had been necessary, that the knowledge gained from the fishing hamlet would advance humanity's evolution by centuries. He showed her the initial findings from the extracted barnacles, the concrete proof that human consciousness could expand beyond its biological limitations. But Maria would hear none of it. Her final words to Willem, preserved in Byrgenwerth's records, were simply, "A corpse should be left well alone," a phrase that would become her eternal refrain in the hunter's nightmare. The immediate aftermath of the massacre saw Byrgenwerth thrown into intense scientific activity. The samples and specimens brought back from the fishing hamlet provided unprecedented insights into the mechanics of human transformation and the nature of insight made physical. Willem's theories about eyes on the inside were vindicated, though the cost of that vindication would prove higher than anyone anticipated. The preserved Orphan became the subject of intensive study, its impossible physiology revealing secrets about the reproduction and development of great ones that no human had possessed before. But even as the scholars celebrated their scientific triumph, signs of the curse began to manifest. Hunters who had participated in the massacre reported disturbing dreams, visions of an endless shore where the screams of the dying never ceased. Some began to see phantom villagers in the corners of their vision, transformed figures that vanished when looked at directly, but whose presence could always be felt. Gehrman, despite his stalwart nature, was particularly affected. Those close to him reported that he would sometimes pause mid-conversation, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear, a crying that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The curse that the fishing hamlet priest had called down wasn't immediate in its full manifestation. Like a seed planted in soil, made fertile by atrocity, it grew slowly, but inexorably. Each hunter who had participated in the massacre found themselves marked in ways that transcended the physical. Their blood itself seemed to carry the weight of their sins, and that weight would be passed on to all who followed in their footsteps. The blood corruption that would later plague Gehrman, the beast scourge that transformed hunters into the very monsters they fought, all of these horrors could trace their roots back to that grey morning on the home shores of the fishing hamlet. The creation of the hunter's nightmare itself represents one of the most complex metaphysical phenomena in Bloodborne's cosmology. It wasn't simply a parallel dimension or a dream in any conventional sense, but rather a prison constructed from the suffering of the victims and the guilt of the perpetrators, given form by Koss's dying curse and sustained by the endless anguish of the Orphan. Every hunter who had participated in the massacre found a piece of their consciousness trapped there upon death, doomed to relive variations of their sins for eternity. But more than that, any hunter who followed in their footsteps, who embraced the blood-drunk violence that had characterized the fishing hamlet massacre, would find themselves similarly cursed. The geography of the hunter's nightmare reflects this origin in disturbing ways. The fishing hamlet, as it appears in the nightmare, isn't simply a recreation, but a distortion, a place where the horror of what happened has been crystallized into eternal form. The buildings lean at impossible angles, defying physical laws as if the very architecture has been twisted by anguish. The remaining villagers exist in a state of perpetual suffering, some still alive despite injuries that should have killed them decades ago, others transformed into even more grotesque shapes by the nightmare's influence. And always, the sound of the orphan's crying echoes across the water, a lament that speaks to loss beyond human comprehension. Lady Maria's presence in the hunter's nightmare deserves special examination. Unlike the other hunters who were dragged there by the curse, she seems to have chosen her imprisonment, taking on the role of guardian to ensure that the secret of the fishing hamlet would remain hidden. Her position in the astral clock tower, that liminal space between the nightmare's layers, allows her to serve as both gatekeeper and warning. Every hunter who seeks to reach the Hamlet must first face her, must prove themselves worthy or unworthy of learning the truth. Her repeated insistence that a corpse should be left well alone isn't just about Kos. It's about the entire tragedy, the knowledge that some secrets are better left buried. The battle with Lady Maria in the nightmare reveals the depth of her self-loathing and determination. She fights with a fury born of desperation, not to preserve her own existence, but to prevent others from witnessing the shame of what she participated in. When she resorts to using her own blood as a weapon, she's literally fighting with the substance that carries her guilt, transforming her contamination into a final futile attempt at redemption through prevention. Her defeat doesn't bring her peace. It merely allows the cycle to continue, another hunter moving closer to the truth that she died trying to hide. Gehrman's connection to the Orphan adds another layer of tragedy to an already horrific tale. The first hunter, the man who had led the expedition with such cold efficiency, found himself inexorably linked to the being they had torn from Kos's corpse. The crying that plagued his dreams wasn't just psychological, but a metaphysical connection, a bond forged in the moment of ultimate violation that could never be severed. The fact that Gehrman only finds peace when the Orphan is finally defeated in the hunter's nightmare speaks to the depth of this connection. His consciousness was partially trapped with the Orphans, two beings bound together by an act of cosmic criminality. The scholars at Byrgenwerth, initially triumphant in their acquisition of unprecedented knowledge, gradually came to understand the true price of their actions. The schism that split the college, leading to the formation of the Healing Church and the School of Mensis, can be traced directly to disagreements over how to interpret and utilize the fishing Hamlet findings. Lawrence believed that the blood of the Great Ones, synthesized from samples taken during the Massacre, could be used to elevate humanity through communion rather than understanding. Mikolash, conversely, became obsessed with the idea of creating artificial Great Ones, using the Orphan's physiology as a template for impossible experiments. Master Willem himself, the architect of the Massacre, retreated deeper into his studies, eventually transforming himself into something barely recognizable as human in his pursuit of enlightenment. Whether his transformation was an attempt to transcend the guilt of his actions, or simply the logical conclusion of his theories, remains unknown. What we do know is that he never publicly acknowledged the fishing Hamlet massacre, never admitted to the crime that had provided the foundation for all of Byrgenwerth's later achievements. His silence on the matter speaks volumes. Either he considered the act so necessary that it required no justification, or so abhorrent that no justification was possible. The long-term consequences of the fishing Hamlet massacre ripple throughout the entire history of Gehrman and beyond. The Healing Church's blood ministration, derived from the studies conducted on the villagers' remains, would transform an entire city into a charnel house. The beast scourge that emerged from the old blood was, in many ways, a manifestation of the curse. Humanity's attempt to evolve using stolen knowledge, resulting in regression to bestial forms. Every hunter who succumbed to bloodlust, every citizen transformed into a beast, every scholar driven mad by insight, all of them were, in some sense, paying the price for Byrgenwerth's original sin. The Orphan of Kos itself represents one of the most tragic figures in this entire narrative. An unborn great one, torn from its mother's corpse before it could properly develop, trapped in a state between life and death for decades, or possibly centuries. Its manifestation in the hunter's nightmare as a violent, screaming creature, wielding its own placenta as a weapon isn't just disturbing imagery, It's a physical representation of birth trauma taken to cosmic extremes. The orphan attacks not out of evil, but out of pain and confusion, lashing out at a world that violated it before it could even properly enter it. The possibility of ending the curse through defeating the orphan's shadow raises profound questions about redemption and forgiveness in a universe that seems designed to perpetuate suffering. When a hunter finally defeats the orphan in the nightmare and returns its shadow to Kos's corpse, the act represents not victory, but mercy, allowing both mother and child to finally find the peace that was denied them. The fact that this act of mercy can only be accomplished through violence, that peace can only be achieved through combat, speaks to the fundamental tragedy of the hunter's existence. The villagers themselves, those who survived the initial massacre and fled to the sea, became something else entirely in the nightmare. Their continued existence in that cursed realm, transformed by decades or centuries of suffering into beings barely recognizable as once human, represents the ultimate injustice of the massacre. They had committed no crime except proximity to a great one's corpse, had threatened no one except in the hunter's imaginations, yet they were condemned to eternal torment. Their prayers for eyes, for understanding, were answered in the cruelest possible way, granted insight into the depths of human cruelty and cosmic indifference. The curse's extension to all blood-drunk hunters, not just those who participated in the original massacre, reveals the viral nature of violence in Bloodborne's universe. The actions at the fishing hamlet created a metaphysical contamination that spread through blood and behavior, ensuring that every hunter who embraced the same brutal methods would share in the same damnation. This isn't mere poetic justice, but a fundamental alteration of reality itself. Kos's dying curse literally rewrote the rules of existence to ensure that such crimes could never go unpunished. Modern interpretations of the fishing hamlet massacre within the game's community have evolved considerably since Bloodborne's release. Initially viewed as simply another example of humanity's cruelty in pursuit of knowledge, deeper analysis has revealed it to be the foundational crime that underlies the entire game's narrative. Every major tragedy in Bloodborne can trace its lineage back to that morning on the beach, from the beast scourge to the nightmare realms, from the corruption of the healing church to the madness of the school of Mensis. Some scholars argue that the massacre was inevitable given the nature of human ambition when confronted with cosmic truth. They point to the pattern repeated throughout the game's lore. Whenever humanity discovers evidence of the Great Ones, the result is invariably catastrophe. The Pthumerians, the healing church, the school of Mensis all followed similar paths of discovery, exploitation, and downfall. In this reading, the fishing hamlet massacre was simply the most egregious example of a pattern written into the very fabric of existence. Others maintain that the massacre represented a unique moral failing, a moment when humanity had the choice to approach the cosmic with reverence rather than violence, and chose the path of brutality. They note that the villagers had achieved a form of coexistence with Kos's influence, transforming but not degenerating, evolving but maintaining their essential humanity. If Byrgenwerth had approached them with respect, had sought to learn through observation and communication rather than dissection and murder, perhaps the entire trajectory of Gehrman's history could have been different. The role of the Great Ones themselves in these events remains enigmatic. Kos was already dead when the massacre occurred, yet her curse manifested with terrible power. This suggests that Great Ones exist in states that transcend our understanding of life and death, that their influence can persist and even grow stronger after their physical forms cease to function. The orphan's continued existence in some form, despite being extracted from its mother's corpse in an undeveloped state, further complicates our understanding of Great One biology and consciousness. The relationship between insight and eyes, so central to the massacre's purpose, reveals fundamental truths about Bloodborne's cosmology. The barnacle growths on the villagers' skulls weren't mere physical mutations, but manifestations of expanded consciousness, literal eyes opening on the inside of their skulls to perceive dimensions beyond the physical. Willem's obsession with obtaining these eyes drove the massacre, but the irony is that true insight cannot be stolen. It must be earned through understanding, not taken through violence. The hunters and scholars who consumed the extracted eyes gained knowledge, but not wisdom. Power, but not transcendence. As we near the end of this deep dive into one of gaming's darkest moments, it's worth reflecting on what the Fishing Hamlet massacre teaches us about the nature of progress and the price of knowledge. In Bloodborne's universe, as perhaps in our own, the pursuit of advancement without ethical consideration leads inevitably to horror. The scholars of Byrgenwerth believed that their goals justified any means, that the evolution of humanity was worth any number of individual tragedies. But their actions created a cascade of suffering that ultimately consumed not just them, but entire civilizations. The figure of Lady Maria stands as perhaps the only redemptive element in this tale of atrocity. Her recognition of the horror of her actions, her attempt to make amends through eternal guardianship, and her warning to future generations that a corpse should be left well alone, represent the possibility of learning from grave mistakes. Though she cannot undo the massacre, her presence in the hunter's nightmare serves as a testament to the importance of acknowledging wrongdoing and attempting, however futilely, to prevent its repetition. The defeat of the Orphan and the potential lifting of the curse offers a glimmer of hope in an otherwise unrelentingly dark narrative. The fact that it's possible to grant peace to both Kos and her child, to end the cycle of vengeance and suffering that has persisted for so long, suggests that even the most terrible sins might eventually find some form of resolution. Not forgiveness, perhaps. The dead villagers remain dead. Their suffering cannot be undone, but at least an end to the perpetuation of anguish. The Fishing Hamlet massacre stands as Byrgenwerth's greatest sin, not just because of the immediate horror it represented, but because of how it fundamentally corrupted everything that followed. The knowledge gained from the massacre poisoned every institution that used it, turned every advancement into a step toward degradation. The blood ministration that was supposed to heal instead created beasts. The insight that was supposed to elevate instead drove men mad. The evolution that was supposed to transcend humanity instead reduced it to something less than human. In reconstructing these events minute by minute, we see how atrocity builds upon itself, how single moments of moral failure cascade into avalanches of horror. The first death at the hamlet's edge led inexorably to the systematic slaughter that followed. The decision to extract the barnacles from living skulls made the violation of Kos almost inevitable. Each step across the moral event horizon made the next step easier, until actions that would have been unthinkable at the journey's beginning became mere procedure by its end. The hunter's nightmare itself serves as an eternal monument to these crimes, a realm where the horror of the Fishing Hamlet massacre plays out in endless variations. Every blood-drunk hunter who finds themselves trapped there becomes part of the tableau, another actor in a play that can never reach its conclusion. They hunt and are hunted, kill and are killed, in cycles that mirror the original violence, while never allowing for resolution or redemption. It's a punishment that fits the crime. Those who embraced violence without restraint are condemned to experience it without end. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration into one of Bloodborne's most significant events, we must acknowledge that the Fishing Hamlet massacre is more than just a piece of gaming lore. It's a meditation on the dangers of unchecked ambition, the corruption of knowledge pursued without wisdom, and the lasting consequences of atrocity. The curse that Kos laid upon the hunters wasn't merely supernatural punishment, but a literalization of a fundamental truth. Violence begets violence, cruelty spawns cruelty, and the blood of the innocent cries out across generations for justice. The ultimate tragedy of the fishing hamlet massacre lies not just in the immediate suffering it caused, but in how it foreclosed other possibilities. What might have been learned from peaceful contact with the transformed villagers? What wisdom might Kos have imparted if approached with reverence rather than violated in death? What could the orphan have become if allowed to develop naturally rather than torn from its mother's corpse? These questions have no answers because Byrgenwerth's hunger for immediate knowledge destroyed any chance of finding out. Today, as we piece together these fragments of lore scattered throughout the hunter's nightmare and beyond, we serve as witnesses to events that the perpetrators tried to hide. Every player who uncovers the truth of the fishing hamlet, who defeats Lady Maria and walks those cursed shores, who faces the orphan and grants it peace, participates in a kind of digital archaeology of atrocity. We cannot change what happened, but we can ensure it's not forgotten, that the victim's suffering is acknowledged and the perpetrator's sin are remembered. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of Bloodborne's darkest and most pivotal moments. The Fishing Hamlet Massacre stands as a reminder that in our pursuit of evolution and transcendence, we must never lose sight of our humanity, never let our ambitions override our compassion. If this exploration has given you new insights into Bloodborne's incredible lore, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining our community of lore seekers. Your support makes these extensive investigations possible and helps bring these hidden narratives to light. Share your own theories and interpretations in the comments below. The beauty of Bloodborne's storytelling lies in how it invites us all to become archaeologists of its buried truths. Until next time, remember Lady Maria's warning, for some corpses should indeed be left well alone, and some knowledge comes at too high a price. This has been Keen 7 Lore, and may you find your worth in the waking world.